What happens when a young black woman is wrongfully detained by a police officer who believes he can use his power to control her? What begins as a routine encounter quickly escalates into a battle for justice, revealing the deep flaws in the system. As this woman stands firm against the officer's abuse of power, she uncovers hidden truths that no one expected. Will the system break her, or will she be the one to expose it? Hit that like button, leave your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe for more stories of resilience and justice that you won't want to miss. The city of Boulder, Colorado, was buzzing with life as it typically did on a bright Saturday morning. People crowded the cafes and shops, soaking up the warmth of the sun as the weekend unfolded. But for Amara Johnson, today was different. As the founder and CEO of a thriving tech startup, Amara had spent the better part of the morning discussing her company's latest venture with investors. It had been a productive meeting, and as the sun shone brightly overhead, Amara felt a moment of peace, a rare occurrence amidst the constant hustle of building her business from the ground up. Dressed in a sharp blazer and jeans, Amara looked like any other young professional heading to her next destination. She had a meeting scheduled with a mentor, but for now, her thoughts were on the exciting opportunities ahead. She was in a hurry, but there was no rush in her step, just the rhythm of someone confident in where they were headed. As she neared the intersection of Main Street and 12th Avenue, the sharp screech of tires on asphalt abruptly interrupted her thoughts. She glanced up to see the flashing blue and red lights of a police car pulling up behind her. She barely had time to register the sound before the car came to a halt in front of her, and Officer Mitchell, a middle-aged white cop with short-cropped hair, stepped out with deliberate slowness. "Hey, you," he barked, his voice cutting through the buzz of the street like a blade. "You're in a bit of a hurry, aren't you?" Amara paused mid-step, surprised by the abruptness of the encounter. She turned slowly to meet the officer's gaze. He was standing a few feet away, his hands resting on his utility belt as he scanned her up and down, his eyes sizing her up like she was a potential threat. "Do you need something, officer?" Amara asked, her voice calm but laced with curiosity. She could already feel the tension starting to build, but she didn't want to assume anything. "Mind telling me where you're headed, huh?" Officer Mitchell asked, his tone now sharp and suspicious. His gaze didn't leave her face, and he took a step forward as if to block her path. "You seem like you're in a rush." Amara glanced around. Pedestrians continued to walk past, most not even acknowledging the tension building between her and the officer. She could feel their eyes on her, though. Some were watching with concern, while others pretended not to notice. "I'm just heading to a meeting," Amara replied, her voice steady. "Is there a problem, officer?" Officer Mitchell's lips curled into a small, almost dismissive smile. He seemed to be enjoying the control he had over the situation, the way he had made her stop. "A meeting, huh?" he asked, stepping a little closer. "What kind of meeting? You don't look like someone just heading to a coffee shop." Amara took a deep breath. She knew exactly what was happening. She'd been through enough situations like this before to recognize the patterns, the suspicion, the racial profiling, the subtle tactics to make her feel like she was in the wrong. She had encountered this type of behavior from authority figures more times than she cared to admit, but today, she wasn't going to let it slide. Not when everything she had worked for was at stake. "I'm a business owner," Amara said, holding her ground. She didn't back away. Her posture was calm, but she wasn't intimidated. "I'm heading to meet with the potential partner for my startup." "I'm sorry, officer, but I don't have time for this." The officer's eyes narrowed, and for a split second, Amara saw something shift behind his gaze, something that wasn't about concern for her or her business. It was about control, about asserting authority over someone he presumed didn't belong in this space. Well, Officer Mitchell said, taking another step closer to her. His tone had shifted, now laced with an accusatory edge. "Business owner, huh? Let me ask you something, Amara. What's in that bag of yours?" Amara glanced down at her shoulder bag, the one she carried with her to every meeting. It was a simple leather messenger bag, neatly packed with a laptop, documents, and a notebook. But she knew the question wasn't about what was inside. It was about who she was and how she looked. To him, she wasn't just a businesswoman. She was a potential threat. A black woman on mission, in a city where she didn't belong. Amara's eyes narrowed. "I'm not sure I understand the question, officer," she said, her voice measured. "I'm carrying my personal belongings. Are you accusing me of something?" Officer Mitchell folded his arms and sneered. "Well, you've got this bag, and you're clearly in a hurry. You look like you've got something to hide. You can't tell me that's normal behavior for someone heading to a meeting. Can you?" Amara's blood pressure rose, but her voice remained steady. This was the moment. This was when everything she had worked for had to come to a head. She wasn't going to let him define the narrative. She wasn't going to let him pull her down into this unjust situation. "Are you accusing me of something?" she asked, her voice hardening slightly. For a moment, the officer hesitated. There was a flicker of doubt in his eyes, a hesitation that suggested he hadn't expected her to call his bluff. But then, he squared his shoulders and stepped closer to her. His hand hovered over the cuffs at his belt. "I'm asking the questions here," Officer Mitchell barked. "I need you to step aside while I check your bag." The crowd had started to gather now. A few people had stopped walking. Others were slowing down, their phones discreetly raised. Amara's heart beat steady in her chest, but her thoughts were clear. She could feel the crowd closing in on her, their eyes on her as she stood in the eye of this storm, a storm she had no intention of letting take her down. As Officer Mitchell moved closer, his hand now firmly resting on his holster, Amara felt a quiet confidence surge through her. She had been in high-pressure situations before, but this one felt different. This wasn't just about her. It was about everyone who had ever been wrongfully accused, who had been profiled, judged, and mistreated. Without breaking eye contact with the officer, Amara slowly reached into her bag and pulled out her FBI identification. She could feel the weight of the moment. The officer, clearly not expecting the sudden reveal, paused as she held it out to him. "FBI Special Agent Amara Carter," she said, her voice steady. "And you, officer, are about to make a very big mistake." The officer's eyes widened, his smug demeanor faltering as the realization hit him. But before he could respond, a loud voice boomed from behind him. "What's going on here?" A new figure emerged from the crowd, a man in a sharp suit, carrying the unmistakable presence of a senior official. Agent Darius Collins, Amara's superior, stepped forward. The air was thick with tension as Agent Darius Collins stepped forward, his presence undeniable. He was a seasoned FBI agent, someone who had worked with Amara on countless operations. His sharp, no-nonsense demeanor immediately cut through the uncertainty that had gripped the crowd and the officers. His eyes scanned Officer Mitchell, who now stood frozen in place, his hand still hovering near his holster. The entire scene had shifted. No longer was this just about a simple seating dispute or an unprovoked confrontation. This was something deeper, something that could have consequences far beyond the street where it had all started. "You've got a lot of explaining to do, officer," Agent Collins said, his voice calm but laced with authority. He didn't raise it, but the power of his words reverberated through the tense silence of the crowd. Tasha's heart pounded in her chest, but she maintained her composure. She had worked hard to get to this point, and now that she had made her identity clear, she wasn't going to back down. This was the moment when everything changed. Officer Mitchell had crossed the line, and now there was no going back. Agent Collins stepped closer, his eyes locked on Mitchell's with a mixture of disdain and understanding. He knew exactly what had happened here. He could see the signs of racial profiling, the arrogance, and the assumption that Amara, simply by the color of her skin, was somehow less than or unworthy of respect. "I think you owe Miss Carter an apology, officer," Collins said, his gaze never leaving the officer. Mitchell shifted uncomfortably, clearly taken aback by the sudden turn of events. He opened his mouth to say something, but quickly closed it when he saw the steely resolve in Collins's eyes. The agent wasn't asking for cooperation. He was demanding it. "I didn't know," Mitchell stammered. "I didn't know she was." "You didn't know." "Right. You didn't know because you didn't care." Collins's voice was low, but the venom behind his words was unmistakable. He turned to the growing crowd of onlookers, many of whom had been recording the altercation. This is the kind of behavior that should never happen again. Not in this city. Not anywhere. The crowd was watching intently now, some people whispering to one another, others still recording. Amara could feel the collective energy in the air shift. It was as if everyone had collectively decided that this moment mattered, that they were witnesses to something bigger than just an isolated incident. Amara took a deep breath. Her hand was still clutching her bag, but now she stood tall, shoulders back, resolute. This was more than just a simple misunderstanding. It wasn't about the seat. It wasn't even about this officer's arrogance anymore. It was about justice, about making sure that those who abused their power were held accountable. "Amara, thank you," Agent Collins said, his voice softer now as he turned to her. "I've been watching from the corner. You handled this perfectly." Amara smiled faintly. "I didn't have a choice," she replied, her voice steady. "It's either stand up or let it slide. I've spent my whole career making sure my voice is heard, and I won't let anyone take that from me." Collins nodded in agreement. "You're right. It's time the world hears the truth." He paused for a moment, his gaze shifting back to the officer, still standing uncomfortably. "I suggest you go back to your car, Officer Mitchell. You're lucky today wasn't the day the federal investigation on you started. You're already walking on thin ice." Mitchell opened his mouth to argue, but then seemed to think better of it. He turned without another word and walked back to his patrol car, his steps slow, his shoulders slumped. The arrogance had disappeared entirely. The crowd, once a murmur of confusion and suspicion, now felt like a collective exhale of relief. People began to clap. It wasn't loud or exuberant, but it was there, a subtle show of solidarity, a quiet acknowledgement that someone had done the right thing. Amara couldn't help but smile. This was the feeling she had always worked toward, the belief that people could come together, stand for what was right, and demand change. This moment mattered. As Mitchell drove away, the situation began to settle, but Tasha's thoughts were already moving ahead, processing everything that had happened. The confrontation with the officer had been intense, but the real challenge was just beginning. The incident on the street would no doubt make waves, but the story was still unfolding. The systemic issues that had allowed this kind of racial profiling to persist would not disappear with one interaction, no matter how much it had shaken Officer Mitchell. Her phone buzzed again. This time, it was a message from Marcus, her colleague and trusted ally in the FBI. "It's time. We've got the backup we need. Let's make sure we take down the network behind Mitchell. There's much more to this than just him." Tasha took a deep breath, her pulse quickening. The fight was far from over. This wasn't just about the officer who had harassed her. It was about everything that he represented. A system that used power, privilege, and prejudice to keep people like her from rising to the top, to prevent them from being heard. But today, things were different. Amara looked over at Collins, who was watching her closely. "What's next?" she asked. Collins gave her a quick, understanding nod. "We've got the wheels in motion. The system is about to get a real shake-up." Just then, the sound of police sirens rose in the distance. It wasn't just the end of her encounter with Officer Mitchell. It was the beginning of something much larger, an investigation that would go far beyond this one incident. It was time to hold the system accountable, and Amara knew she was at the center of this storm. "We're just getting started," Tasha said, turning toward the growing crowd that had witnessed the confrontation. "And I won't stop until we get what we deserve." As Tasha began to walk toward the sidewalk, a car pulled up beside her. She didn't look back at first, thinking it was just another passing vehicle. But then, the window rolled down, and a familiar face emerged from inside. "Miss Carter," the voice said, and Tasha froze. It was Richard Holbrook, the CEO of the corporation she had been battling for months. Tasha's heart skipped a beat. What was he doing here? Why was he in Boulder? Before she could say anything, he spoke again, his tone all business. "I have a proposition for you. We need to talk. It's bigger than just what you've seen." The weight of his words hit her, and she felt a chill of uncertainty settle in her chest. Tasha knew that the fight for justice had only just begun, and now the game was about to change. Tasha's heart raced as the seconds stretched into minutes. She stood still, her body tense but composed, as she watched Holbrook's arrogance begin to falter. She had seen this before. The confident man who thought he could control everything, only to realize too late that the tables had turned. But this time, she wasn't just standing up for herself. She was taking down an empire. The agents were closing in. The sound of sirens grew louder as the vehicles pulled into the lot next to the plane. The tension was unbearable, the space between Tasha and Holbrook charged with an electric silence. Amara didn't look back. She had already sent the message she needed to send, and the federal agents knew everything they needed to know. Holbrook had no idea what was coming for him. "You think this is over?" Holbrook sneered, his expression now one of desperation. Tasha didn't flinch. "No, Holbrook," she said evenly, her voice steady and unwavering. "This is where it all begins." The moment the words left her lips, Holbrook's smirk faded into confusion. He looked from Tasha to the approaching agents, realizing that the full weight of the investigation was no longer just breathing down his neck. It was about to suffocate him. As the agents closed in, Holbrook quickly turned to the flight crew. His hand reached for his wallet, pulling out hundreds of dollars, a desperate attempt to bribe the crew into siding with him. "We don't need your money, sir." The agent who had been closest to Holbrook stepped forward, his voice cold and commanding. "You're under arrest for money laundering, fraud, and conspiracy." Tasha could see the shock on Holbrook's face as the agents quickly and professionally secured him in handcuffs. He opened his mouth, about to say something, but the words failed him. He had spent his life manipulating the system, playing by his own rules, but now he was on the other side of that equation. One of the agents, tall and built like a linebacker, leaned over and whispered something in Holbrook's ear. Holbrook's face paled even further. Whatever the agent had said clearly struck a nerve, and it was evident that Holbrook realized how deep the web of corruption went. He wasn't just facing one federal agent. He was facing an entire operation closing in on him. Tasha stood silently, watching as Holbrook was escorted away by the federal agents. She couldn't help but feel a rush of satisfaction. This was what she had fought for. This was the moment when everything she had worked for, the years of hard work, the late nights, the strategy, came to fruition. The corrupt system was finally starting to crumble, and Holbrook was the first casualty in that battle. As Holbrook was driven away in the back of a federal vehicle, the silence in the cabin of the plane was deafening. The flight crew had stopped their movements, their eyes fixed on the unfolding situation. Tasha's hand was still gripping the armrest of her seat, but her body had relaxed now, the tension slowly fading from her muscles. The battle had been fought, and she had emerged victorious. But that was only the beginning. The fight was far from over. As the plane continued its descent into a secure location, Tasha took a moment to compose herself. The relief of seeing Holbrook arrested didn't last long. There was still much to do, much to expose. Holbrook's arrest was just a piece of a much larger puzzle, and it would take more than just one win to dismantle the corruption he had helped build. There were still more names to uncover and more investigations to launch. As the plane touched down, Tasha's phone buzzed in her pocket. She pulled it out and quickly unlocked it, her pulse quickening when she saw the urgent message from Marcus. "We've got him. But Tasha, there's something bigger going on here. You're not done yet. Get back to the office. There's a meeting scheduled with the task force." Tasha's heart skipped a beat. She had already suspected there was more to this than just Holbrook, but now it was clear. The system of corruption wasn't going to fall with just one arrest. As the plane touched down on the secure runway, the doors opened, and the agents began to disembark with Holbrook. But Tasha didn't follow them right away. She turned to look at Agent Collins, who had been with her through the entire ordeal. His expression was unreadable, but she could sense the same tension in his posture. "We've only scratched the surface, haven't we?" Tasha asked quietly. Agent Collins nodded, his eyes scanning the agents already on the ground. "This goes much deeper than we thought. Holbrook was just a small part of a much larger operation. As Tasha stepped off the plane, her mind was already processing what came next. She had won today, but the real battle was far from over. The system she was fighting had been in place for years, and breaking it apart would take time, resources, and, most importantly, the will to keep pushing forward despite the challenges. She had already brought one of the biggest players down, but now she had to ensure that Holbrook wasn't just an isolated incident. The doors to the secure compound opened as the agents moved Holbrook inside. Tasha glanced over at Agent Collins, her thoughts clouded with uncertainty and resolve. "What happens next?" she asked. Collins turned to her, his eyes focused. "We take down everyone involved. Every single one of them." Tasha didn't say anything in response. She knew exactly what that meant. It wasn't just about bringing one man to justice. It was about taking down an entire network. Tasha's feet hit the tarmac as she stepped off the plane, her mind still reeling from the series of events that had unfolded over the last few hours. Holbrook was in custody, but she could sense something bigger was lurking in the shadows. The pieces of the puzzle weren't just going to fall into place overnight. There was more to this investigation than just one man, a lot more. The federal agents had moved quickly, efficiently. Holbrook had been detained, and now he was under lock and key, ready to face charges that would unravel the corrupt web he had built. But what about the rest of the system? The powerful figures who had helped him evade the law for so long? Tasha's thoughts were interrupted by the sound of Agent Collins' voice as he walked up beside her, his face stern but calm. "You okay?" he asked, glancing sideways at her as they made their way toward the black SUV waiting nearby. Tasha nodded, though she could feel the weight of the day pressing heavily on her. "Yeah, just processing it all. We got him, but the job's not done, is it?" Agent Collins shook his head. "No, Holbrook's just the beginning. This thing runs deeper than we thought." As they climbed into the SUV, the doors locked with a click, and the car began to pull away from the airport. The night sky loomed above, dark and heavy, as though it knew the storm was far from over. Tasha's resolve was already hardening. She had fought long and hard for everything she had achieved, and now the fight wasn't just personal. It was for every voice that had been ignored by the system. As they drove, Agent Collins handed her a folder filled with new intel. "This came through a few minutes ago," he said, his voice lowering with caution. "It's about Holbrook's dealings. We've got several offshore accounts, some political ties, and a few names that might ring a bell." Tasha opened the folder, skimming over the documents. Holbrook wasn't just a businessman. He was the keystone in a much larger operation, one that stretched far beyond the borders of this city, and possibly even beyond the country's borders. One name in particular stood out, printed in bold at the top of a page: Senator William Clark. Tasha's heart skipped a beat. She had heard of him, but she hadn't anticipated this. Clark was a high-profile politician with ties to some of the most influential lobbyists in the nation. His name had been dropped in passing conversations, but never in connection to someone like Holbrook. Tasha had her suspicions about the political world's deep-seated corruption, but now she had a direct link between a senator and the criminal network Holbrook had orchestrated. "Clark," Tasha's voice was sharp as she looked up from a folder. "This goes all the way to Capitol Hill." "Exactly." Collins's voice was steady, but there was a trace of concern in it. "And that's just the beginning. There's a network of high-ranking officials, business leaders, and even some law enforcement officers who have been feeding into this operation. Holbrook may have been the one we caught, but he's just the tip of the iceberg." Tasha's mind was racing. She had known that corruption ran deep in certain circles, but this was on a scale she hadn't imagined. The car slowed as they neared a secure facility, the lights from the building casting long shadows across the darkened street. Tasha felt her stomach tighten. This wasn't just about taking down one criminal. This was about bringing down an entire system. As they parked and made their way into the building, the federal agents were already assembling in the conference room. The walls were lined with whiteboards, and the air was thick with the scent of fresh coffee and tension. "All right, everyone, let's get to work." Collins said as he entered the room, his presence commanding immediate attention. "We've got Holbrook in custody, but the real fight is just beginning. We need to move fast. If we're going to take down this operation, we need everyone working together." The agents around the table nodded, each one familiar with the gravity of the situation. They weren't just looking at Holbrook anymore. They were looking at an entire network, a web of corruption that had been woven through the very fabric of the system. As the meeting began, Tasha's phone buzzed again. She glanced at the screen, her pulse quickening when she saw the name Marcus on the display. Marcus had been the one who had tipped her off about Holbrook's illegal dealings, and if he was reaching out now, it could mean one of two things. Either they had solid evidence to move forward, or something was about to go terribly wrong. "Hold on," Tasha said, excusing herself briefly from the meeting. She stepped outside the conference room, her heart pounding as she answered the call. "Tasha, it's bad." Marcus's voice came through urgently. "Clark's people have made a move. They're going to cover their tracks. We need to act fast." Tasha's blood ran cold. Senator Clark wasn't just involved. He was trying to silence the investigation before it could go any further. "How bad is it?" Tasha asked, her voice steady despite the rising panic inside her. "Bad enough that we need to hit them where it hurts. You've got to come back to the office now. The senator's got people in high places pulling strings, and if we don't make our move fast, they'll bury this. We need to expose them all before they can erase everything." Tasha turned back to the conference room, her mind working at lightning speed. They were at a crossroads now. The entire network of corruption was exposed, but the danger was greater than ever. If they didn't act quickly, they could lose everything. Tasha looked over at Collins, who was already heading toward her, his expression grim. "What's going on?" he asked, his voice low but filled with urgency. "We've got a lot of ground to cover," Tasha said, her voice steady as she turned back to Marcus's call. "And we don't have much time." The tension in the room was thick enough to choke anyone standing there. Every agent, every analyst, every person in the room knew that they were standing on the precipice of something huge, something that could bring down the entire system. And in that moment, Tasha Carter could feel the weight of what they were about to face. This was it. There would be no turning back after today. She had fought for this, fought through every obstacle, every setback, and now the enemy wasn't just one corrupt businessman. It was an entire network, a web of deceit, manipulation, and power that reached into the highest levels of government and corporate control. As she sat at the conference table with Agent Collins and the other federal agents, the hum of the fluorescent lights overhead was the only sound cutting through the tension. Marcus, who had been working the angles on the financial side, was on the phone, his face grim. "Tasha, I've got more bad news." Marcus's voice crackled through the speakerphone. "Clark's people are shutting down key accounts. They've already moved millions into untraceable holdings, and if we don't move now, we'll lose everything." Tasha's pulse quickened. The senator's involvement had only deepened the stakes. William Clark, a high-ranking senator, had more than just influence. He had the power to squash any investigation, to bury any truth that threatened his grip on power. And now they were on the clock. "We can't wait for the paperwork to catch up," Tasha said, looking at Agent Collins. Her voice was steady, but there was a steel edge to it. "We need to go directly after Clark. If we wait, he'll cover his tracks and use his position to shut us down. The longer we wait, the more dangerous this becomes." Collins gave a curt nod. "Agreed. Let's move. We can't afford to lose any more ground. We'll use everything we have to bring him down." The federal agents were already in motion, organizing the team, prepping for the next steps. The FBI was ready to strike, but this wasn't going to be just a raid. It was going to be a battle, one that would require finesse, precision, and complete commitment. Tasha paced the room, her mind racing as she formulated the plan in her head. They would need to hit Clark's offices and Holbrook's remaining assets simultaneously. They had already gathered evidence from Holbrook's dealings, but now it was time to go after Clark's political power, his ties to criminal syndicates, his hidden funds, and his ability to destroy anyone who stood in his way. "We have to cut off his influence fast," Tasha said, If we go after the assets first, we can cripple his ability to move money. But we'll need to have surveillance teams ready to catch him in the act. Marcus's voice came back through the speaker. I've got the financials. We've tracked most of his shell companies to a holding in Wyoming. But here's the kicker. He's meeting with key lobbyists tomorrow morning. If we don't stop this, he's going to have everything laundered and out of reach. Wyoming, Tasha repeated, her mind already working through the logistics. We can move in and shut down the transfer, but we need to catch him in the act. The senators and corporate heads who are involved with him will make this difficult. They'll try to cover up everything. We'll move on his meeting and hit the assets at the same time, Collins said, pulling out a map from the stack of documents. He began marking locations with the red marker. This needs to be clean and quick. Once we move, we'll have no time to waste. Tasha nodded, feeling the weight of everything they had worked for. This was no longer just a corporate scandal. It was about dismantling a network that had manipulated power for years. She had been fighting for justice since she first joined the FBI, and now the stakes were higher than ever. Today was the day she could make a real difference. It was early morning when the agent set into motion. The plan was clear. Hit Clark's residence first, secure the meeting with his lobbyists, and take down Holbrook's remaining assets. The FBI would surround the building in Wyoming where his shell companies were hidden, and they would get to Clark before he could cover his tracks. Tasha was in the lead, with Collins at her side. The two of them had arranged every detail. The vehicles, the timing, the legal warrants. They were prepared for every possible outcome. Holbrook might have been the first target, but Clark was the real enemy. As the federal agents stormed Clark's office, Tasha felt a sense of both relief and determination. They were finally making their move, exposing corruption and injustice for what it was, and nothing was going to stop them now. The surveillance footage showed Clark entering the building. His face was no longer the calm, collected expression of a politician. It was the face of a man who knew his empire was about to fall. His back was stiff as he entered the meeting, clearly aware of the weight of the situation. But what he didn't know was that this meeting, this final moment of control, would be the end of his reign. Tasha and Collins watched from the command center as Clark spoke to his lobbyists, unaware of the agents closing in around him. The walls of his empire were crumbling. He could feel it, but he didn't know how close the agents were to taking him down. As the agents prepared to make their move, one final message popped up on Tasha's screen. It was from Marcus. Tasha, we've got a major problem. Clark's not just meeting with lobbyists. He's planning something bigger. He's already setting up a new network with international ties. We can't let him out of this building. Tasha's breath caught in her throat. This wasn't just a simple bust anymore. It was much bigger than she had realized. Clark wasn't going down quietly, and this wouldn't be the end of his operation. As the agents closed in, one of the lobbyists in the room with Clark looked directly into the camera. His eyes widened, and he reached for his phone. Tasha's mind raced, knowing that in the next few moments, everything could change. Was this the final strike against Clark? Or would it spark something much larger than they were prepared for? The tension in the room was palpable, every agent on edge, every moment hanging by a thread. Tasha Carter had been through countless high-stakes operations during her time with the FBI, but nothing could prepare her for what was about to unfold. Senator William Clark, once an untouchable political figure, was now on the brink of being exposed for the criminal mastermind he truly was. As the agents moved into position, the sound of their boots echoed through the building. Tasha stood in the command center, her eyes focused on the live feed of the building's security cameras. Clark was still in the meeting room, talking animatedly with his lobbyists, completely unaware of the imminent storm about to break over him. "We've got eyes on him," Collins said, his voice calm but taut with anticipation. "This is it. Let's bring him in." Tasha didn't flinch. She had been preparing for this moment for what felt like an eternity, but now that it was finally here, there was no room for hesitation. This was more than just a bust. This was the culmination of everything she had worked for, the moment when the corrupt system that had kept people like Holbrook and Clark in power would finally be exposed for what it was. "All right, agents, go." Collins's command echoed through the room as the agents made their move. Tasha watched intently, her heart pounding as the agents moved quickly and quietly through the halls of the building. They knew exactly where Clark was, and they had him cornered. This wasn't just a raid. It was a decisive strike. Moments later, the agent leading the charge came over the intercom. Clark's been apprehended. We've got him, and his entire operation is coming down. Tasha felt a wave of relief flood through her. They had done it. Clark was finally in custody, but the work didn't end there. The files and evidence they had seized from his offices were just the beginning. There were more names, more politicians, more business leaders, and corporate executives who had to be brought to justice. Clark was only the first domino to fall. Hours later, Tasha sat in her office, the weight of the day settling heavily on her shoulders. The news had already begun to circulate. Senator Clark was arrested for his involvement in a massive criminal syndicate, laundering money through corrupt political deals. Holbrook's empire had crumbled, and now Clark's operation was next. But this wasn't just about the big names. This was about the people who had been hurt by the system, those who had been silenced for too long. Tasha ran her hands over her face, exhausted but proud. The FBI had done what many had believed was impossible. They had exposed the truth. And now, with Clark behind bars, the public had begun to see the reality of the corruption that had been hidden for so long. The phone on her desk buzzed, and Tasha picked it up, still lost in thought. It was Marcus, her right-hand man, and the one who had helped her navigate the treacherous waters of this investigation. "We've got the full picture, Tasha," Marcus said. "Clark's network is huge, but now that he's in custody, we can go after everyone else involved. The fallout is going to be massive, but it's the only way to clean house." Tasha leaned back in her chair, her eyes fixed on the window. The sun was setting, casting an orange glow over the city. For a moment, everything felt still. But she knew this was just the beginning. "It's not over yet, Marcus." Her voice was low but resolute. "There's more to clean up. But we've finally shown people what's been going on behind closed doors. We've shaken the foundation, and it's time for the rest of the house to come down." The next few days were a whirlwind. Tasha was bombarded with media requests, interviews, and questions about the future of the investigation. It felt surreal, the sudden rush of attention, but she took it all in stride. This wasn't about her. It was about the people who had been silenced, the voices that had been ignored, the system that had been allowed to run unchecked for far too long. Tasha knew that the next phase of the operation would be even more difficult than the first. The corruption ran deep, and there were still so many people to bring to justice. But now, she had the momentum and the truth on her side. Her office phone rang, and she answered without hesitation. "Tasha Carter." "Miss Carter," a calm voice on the other end said, "we have everything we need to move forward. The investigation will be in full swing starting tomorrow. There will be more arrests, more people exposed. You've done something incredible here, and the country will be watching." Tasha paused, letting the weight of the words settle in. This wasn't just an isolated win. This was the start of something bigger, a movement for justice that went beyond the individual. It was about taking down a system, one built on manipulation, greed, and exploitation, and exposing it for all to see. "Thank you," Tasha said softly. "Let's make sure no one gets left behind." She hung up the phone and stared at her reflection in the window, her thoughts running a mile a minute. The day had been won, but the war was far from over. She knew the fight wasn't just for her. It was for everyone who had been crushed beneath the weight of the system, everyone who had been told their voices didn't matter. But now, she was going to make sure everyone heard her voice. As Tasha sat in the silence of her office, her mind raced with thoughts of what was to come. The files they had seized from Clark's office were being sifted through, names and dates connected to some of the most powerful people in the country. The story of corruption and greed ran deeper than they had thought, and as the weight of it all pressed down on her, Tasha couldn't help but wonder how many more people were out there, pulling the strings from the shadows. But one thing was certain, this wasn't over. It was only just beginning. Tasha Carter's fight was never just about herself. It was about everyone who has been wronged by a system that's failed them. From the very first moment she stood her ground, she knew the stakes. But today, justice was served. This victory didn't come easy, and it didn't come without sacrifice. But it's a reminder that no matter how deep the corruption runs, the truth will always have a way of shining through. Tasha didn't just expose one corrupt businessman. She exposed the entire system that allowed it to happen. And she did it with strength, dignity, and unwavering determination. If her story inspired you, if you believe in fighting for what's right and standing up to power, hit that like button, share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe for more stories like this, because the fight for justice never stops. Tasha's victory is just one step, but together, we can make sure the truth always prevails.